was here as a kid, and I wanted to show the rest of the family.
It's a place you only get to see a couple times a year, so we thought we'd take a look.
Nothing to worry about. Yeah. This, hey, you're hot.
Yeah.
You're dead.
It can't be just open to the public. We have to actually be here. Especially after 9/11, they've really, made the bases inaccessible. Everything that you see on the table, they're all radioactive.
What do you have from the site?
What do we have from the site? The trinitite.
You have no concerns about that?
No. It's not a danger to you from the radiation aspect unless you eat it.
We heard about this place and we wanted to show our children Ground Zero, where the first atomic bomb was detonating.
On the eve of July 16th, 1945, at the isolated and desolate Trinity test site in New Mexico, final preparations were being made by the most brilliant team of scientists ever assembled. Their goal was the successful construction and detonation of the first weapon of mass destruction. Only one scientist among the hundreds chosen for the Manhattan Project would turn his back on the terrible madness soon to be unleashed. His name was Joseph Rotblat.
If my work is going to be applied, I would like myself to decide how it will be applied. For the first time, it became possible to destroy the whole of the human species. This heralded an entirely new situation in the world. For many years, even perhaps a few centuries, scientists lived in the so-called ivory tower. Many scientists felt that their job is just to pursue pure knowledge. Science has no relation with any human feelings. Scientists have got a role because what they are doing today will tomorrow be applied by technology and then may have an enormous impact on the whole life of everybody.
Joseph Rotblat may have renounced the atomic bomb, but he would struggle for the rest of his long life to dispel its shadow. He became the visionary force behind the Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs, international gatherings of scientists and statesmen designed to discuss the dangers of nuclear proliferation and expose the futility of war.
Dear colleagues and friends, we have really the opportunity in this meeting to establish dialogue and communication across different viewpoints. I am the Secretary General of Pugwash, and on behalf of all of us, I welcome you warmly to Cairo.
With the end of the Cold War, the world breathed a sigh of relief and stumbled on. But for the members of Pugwash, the threat of nuclear weapons never really went away.
The US has very clearly been signaling that they see a role for using nuclear weapons. They talk not only about preemption, but also about retaliation. In the wake of being included in the axis of evil, there was a real rush in North Korea, and of course this nuclear test, whether or not it was a successful nuclear test, is not the issue. Nuclear weapons have not gone away.
It's not scientists who make nuclear weapons anymore. It's a technical matter. It's engineers, it's technicians, it's how much material you can afford to buy, your suppliers. And in fact, the technology now is pretty standard. In fact, you can download a lot of stuff from the internet these days. If I gave my graduate student a project to make a simple atomic bomb, if he didn't come up with a reasonable design 4 years later, I don't think he should get a PhD. So it's come down to that.
There is a fear that a non-state actor might be able to create some kind of a radiological weapon. There's a big worry whenever you have this many nuclear weapons in the world. Accidents are possible. And also in some of the regions where nuclear weapons are now becoming part of the mainstream, who knows what might happen between India and Pakistan, for example. Are they at the same place where America and the Soviet Union were during the Cold War?
The Soviet Union and the United States, they managed to avoid a catastrophe, but this kind of deterrence would not necessarily work for the Middle Eastern countries. The Israelis say we will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons, but we know that they have the capability. If 2 or more countries have nuclear weapons, I think we will have chaos in the region.
The existence of nuclear weapons means that we could potentially create a disequilibrium, an imbalance on the planet and the atmosphere by the launching of some of these systems. Some of these systems. There are 27,000 of these systems. This is more than enough to wipe out the whole planet. You also got people working to say, you know, we've got to save the planet. Well, you're right. We got to save the planet. And so the whole environmental effort, as laudable and as absolutely critical as it is, can be for absolutely naught in a space of hours if these guys actually went at each other.
Meeting annually since 1957, this gathering marks the first time they've assembled without Joseph Rotblat's guiding hand.
Pugwash conferences and Pugwash members have been involved not only in all the nuclear weapon treaties, or I think all of them, during the Cold War era, but in chemical and biological weapons. And it's played a role in bringing the Vietnam War to an end. I don't think Pugwash would have achieved what it did achieve without his guidance and help. Just coming to this office, one misses him. He should be sitting behind his desk, getting up, shaking your hand. He was genial, wonderful old-fashioned politeness, in which he would shake your hands every time he met you. It's sort of Polish politeness. He was a man of absolute integrity.
Joseph Rotblat was born in Warsaw in 1908, the fifth of 7 children.
My memories of him as a young man are mixed up with what I remember of him as an older man, tall, handsome, and charming, because he was always that. I have a clear memory of returning by tram from his flat in Mokotów, near Warsaw, where he lived with his wife, my Aunt Tola. I remember the tram but I don't remember the actual occasion. But I know that on that day, he and Tola told me that I needn't call them aunt and uncle, but I could call them by their first names. I was very proud of that. I was probably about 2½, and it seemed to me a very grand thing to do. I think my uncle got his deep moral sense from his father. My grandfather was something of a patriarch, called on for advice by many people. He was very religious, and Joseph very early showed a precocious talent. He was the star of his Rede class at the age of 4, I gather. So I think my grandfather must have had some hopes that his brilliant eldest son would be a rabbi. But Joseph, he became a skeptic quite early on in his youth, which I think was a grief to his father. My grandfather was a prosperous businessman. He owned a transport firm using horses and carts. I'm talking about the 8 years before World War I. And he did well. He had a nice house. All this came to an end with the First World War. And they ended up living in a rather poky flat in Warsaw, practically penniless. That was almost the end of my uncle's schooling, because there was no money. This is why, as soon as he'd finished primary school, he was sent off to learn to be an electrician. I know that he had more or less given up hope of ever becoming a scientist, but he carried on with his scientific reading and studies well enough to pass the examination to the free evening school, where he got his first degree.
Rotblat would come here to the University of Warsaw and complete a PhD. It was the age of great discoveries in physics, and many scientists, including the Germans, had established that a nuclear bomb was at least theoretically possible.
And very soon after the fission discovery came, I verified this experimentally. From this, it was quite easy to make an imaginary experiment. A chain reaction could occur, in which a large amount of energy is released in a very short time, in other words, an atom bomb. But I immediately put it out of my mind, because as a scientist, I felt it's not my job to devise methods of destruction. It's quite contrary to all my upbringing, and therefore I just didn't want to think about it.
His mind was engaged in other matters, matters of the heart. He married Tola Grin, a university student from Lublin. Friends described them as made for each other. Their life together would be interrupted by an invitation from the University of Liverpool. It was an offer to work alongside James Chadwick, the Nobel Prize-winning British scientist who had discovered the neutron. When Joseph came back to Warsaw for Tola in the summer of 1939, she was ill with appendicitis and unable to travel. Within days of returning to his work in England, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Tola was trapped.
Tola, she was unable to join Joseph. He tried to get her out, and she was ill, and then that was it. The last train had gone. He tried to get her out through Italy, but even that failed when Italy entered the war. So she went to Lublin to live with her parents. My parents asked her to join us, to throw her lot in with ours in Warsaw, but she wouldn't. And then, of course, it was impossible. The ghetto was up, nobody traveled anywhere, at least if you were Jewish, and we lost all contact with her.
I became very worried that indeed the Germans may make the bomb. So I overcame my scruples.
James Chadwick and Joseph Rotblat assembled a team to begin work on an atomic bomb. They realized that their project would require a hugely expensive technological effort that Britain, struggling for its very survival, could ill afford. Their work was disrupted nearly every night. Strikes by Luftwaffe bombers set the evening skies ablaze. Although the Liverpool docks were their primary target, bombs landed all around the university. Chadwick went out to check bomb craters with his Geiger counter. He feared the Germans might mix radioactive material with conventional explosives and create the world's first dirty bomb.
The only way in which we could prevent the Germans from using, if they have a bomb against us, would be if we too had it and threatened to retaliate. In other words, the idea of deterrence, which is now, but now the official policy of superpowers, occurred to me at that time. Of course, looking back, it was a silly idea. For one thing, deterrence assumes that you deal with a rational person who will respond in a rational way. Now, Hitler was not a rational person.
The Americans had their own fears about Hitler's nuclear ambitions and began construction on a new town in a remote part of New Mexico. The locals called it the city on the hill. The town was Los Alamos. It came complete with houses, schools, supermarkets, and one purpose. A mission so secret, only a handful of people knew. There was only one entrance, and the entire town was surrounded by barbed wire. Armed GIs patrolled the perimeter in jeeps. Led by U.S. Army General Leslie Groves and the brilliant physicist Robert Oppenheimer, it was codenamed the Manhattan Project. Here, the energies of scientists, technicians, office workers, and soldiers were committed to a project far more expansive and expensive than future missions to the moon.
I wasn't asked what I wanted to do, but I was told that what the project was about in very rough terms, and that I would be assigned to one of the implosion groups. Oppenheimer insisted that people would be free to interact with each other and help solve each other's problems. It took enormous creativity to assemble the genius category experts from different countries, different disciplines, and expect them and persuade them to work together harmoniously. They were prima donnas in their old positions, but here they had to conform.
Early 1944 marked the arrival of James Chadwick's team of British physicists.
From my point of view as a young scientist, it was almost like a paradise, you know, having always been used to difficulties. Here you find yourself in a place where money didn't matter at all. You find yourself talking to the people about whom you only read before.
What I mainly remember about Rotblat, he was very pleasant and very bright, and he was very worried about Hitler getting the atomic bomb. And you know, there was reason for him to worry. It was critical that we get this project completed and end this war. people understood very well from Hiroshima and all these other places how desperate would have been an invasion of Japan. How many lives would be lost. If we had to invade Japan, the Soviets would have come in from the other direction.
Rotblat's mentor and friend Niels Bohr, the brilliant Danish physicist, wanted to share the technology with the Soviet Union in order to prevent a nuclear arms race. Roosevelt was sympathetic, but Churchill wanted Bohr jailed as an enemy alien. The Los Alamos team included European refugees like Rotblat, socialists, communists, anti-communists, patriots, and pacifists, none of whom were noted for keeping their opinions to themselves. Maintaining secrecy and setting the party line was the responsibility of General Groves, who often hosted dinner parties for the senior scientists.
After dinner, we just sat and talked, and began to talk about all sorts of world affairs. In the course of the conversation, he said to Chadwick, "You realize, of course, that the whole purpose of this project is to subdue the Russians." It came as a terrible shock to me, because you have to remember this was at a time when the main part of the war was going on in Russia. It was the Russians who tried to stem the advance of the Germans, and they suffered all the casualties. The Russians were our allies. Groves said, "Russia is our enemy," and the project proceeds on this basis. From that moment onwards, I felt that the whole thing is wrong. And then I was told through Chadwick from intelligence sources that the Germans have given up their idea of the working on the project. I decided that I should leave. That's the reason why, before the end of 1944, I told the people in Los Alamos that I wanted to leave. I think I was the only one to do this.
Sworn to secrecy, Rotblat was allowed to leave the Manhattan Project. The intelligence community was highly suspicious of his motives.
Chadwick found this absurd dossier against my uncle, which claimed that he intended to return to Britain, join the RAF, hijack a plane, fly it to Poland, parachute into Poland, and then hand over what he knew to the Russians. I can't imagine anything more absurd. On the way back, all his effects disappeared. He had a suitcase in which he had all sorts of things he treasured, including pictures of his wife, and many other family photographs and many other things he treasured. His case disappeared. Sorry, stolen, can't trace it. I myself believe that somewhere in the bowels of the FBI, that suitcase still exists.
In July of 1945, the highly secret device, which the Los Alamos scientists referred to simply as the gadget, was ready. There was speculation that the chain reaction might set the Earth's atmosphere on fire.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
After the training test, the reaction was pure relief and pure joy. People were really happy that this intense, enormous effort was successful.
Scientists have a responsibility to the society that they live in. If they decide to shut their eyes to this, they are just as culpable as the generals and the soldiers who actually fire those weapons. I met and I was inspired by several people who had worked on the Manhattan Project and had then turned against it, but they turned against it years later, well after the bomb had been tested and had been used. My admiration for Joseph Rotblat comes from the fact that he was there at that time. He didn't say, oh, on the one hand this and on the one hand that. No, he said, this is what I have to do. And that took a lot of courage. As I looked at his history, I was filled with admiration because here was a man who knew war was evil and catastrophic.
Back in Liverpool, Joseph Rotblat waited out the remaining months of the war, anxious to learn the fate of Tola and his family.
6 of us survived together in hiding. We have been through the Warsaw Ghetto. We escaped from the ghetto shortly before it was blown up house by house. We were hidden in the country by a Polish family, but we did survive. Somehow we did it. What was tragic for my mother was that when she telephoned him at Liverpool University after the war to tell him we were alive, he said, well, and where is Tola? And my mother had to say she is dead. But I don't think that even then he had totally given up hope. But I'm afraid there was no hope. He never remarried. I think he could have done so. He had plenty of female admirers, but no, he never considered marriage again.
Within weeks of the successful testing of the atomic bomb, 2 more of the fearsome weapons had been shipped to an American airbase on the Pacific island of Tinian. On August 6, 1945, the bomb called Little Boy was loaded into a B-29 Superfortress. It was released above Hiroshima. Three days later, Nagasaki suffered a similar fate. An estimated 145,000 people died within seconds, and tens of thousands more would later die from radiation sickness. Joseph Rotblat heard the news he was dreading on the radio.
When the BBC announced the destruction of Hiroshima, this is what I heard for the first time. Oh, it's a terrible time, because I still hoped that there was a chance it wouldn't work, but it did work. Then I hoped even if it did work, it wouldn't be used against civilian populations. But it did. And I was shocked. And then there was the fear about further developments.
People read lists of casualties, numbers of people killed. They don't see beyond that to all the bereaved families and the horror of war. The trouble is that the politicians we have now in the world haven't known war and haven't really known the aftermath of war. War is an incredible... My brother died slowly of wounds in an open boat in the Atlantic. My parents never got over that. I would like all political leaders to go and see the Peace Museum in Hiroshima. There's one extraordinary display of this young girl who was only 2 when the bomb fell. She grew up into a healthy girl, and then after 10 years, the radiation sickness took her and she died slowly. She believed in a Japanese myth that if you made 1,000 paper cranes, you could have your dearest wish. She didn't quite make it. Her school friends made the rest for her funeral.
被爆国である日本国政府にはまず謙虚に被爆の実相と被爆者の哲学を学びそれを世界に広める責任があります。
被爆者, that's the Japanese word for the survivors of bombing. What they went through is simply beyond words. We just don't have the vocabulary by which we can accurately represent the suffering. So as a result, the only expression that really expresses the agony of hibakusha is no one else should ever suffer as I did. That's, in a sense, the most accurate description of what they went through. And when they say that, that includes, that no one includes everybody, literally everybody, including those whom you would normally call enemies. All these years, the hibakusha have been advocating that nuclear weapons have no place on this earth.
I think that Hiroshima was a terrible crime. It was a crime against humanity because it targeted innocents. Of course, the Japanese lost hugely from this, but perhaps the real consequence of this was that atomic weapons became legitimized around the world, and countries looked at Hiroshima and said, we want a bomb too, otherwise this may happen to us. And so you had the Soviet Union enter into the atomic race, and then you had one country after the other, out of fear and also out of reasons of wanting prestige, wanting this bomb.
Stalin understood that the nuclear bomb, when it's dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, mostly was aimed against the Soviet Union. When we talk about the Cold War, we have to understand that in the beginning, Soviet Union was in the losing position. It was more nuclear warheads on the American side. The Soviet Union was surrounded by the air bases with the strategic bombers. We live under the pressure that Americans can attack us any day, and we can be this just sitting duck.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
When the Soviets tested the nuclear bomb in 1949, it was some feeling of relief. the scientists who tested them in Kazakhstan, they're eager to go to epicenter when it was not too hard to walk there, just to look inside. And I remember I work in the Kapustin Yar near Stalingrad, and it was rumors that they will test nuclear warhead on the anti-aircraft missile. And we were on the airfield. It was no airport there, waiting for flying back to Moscow. And we were eager to witness this explosion nearby. So we saw this bright flash, nothing else, and then this big boom, and so it all was close to the explosion. At that time, people, except few scientists who was very close to this, never thought how dangerous it is, because nobody tested how you was much exposed, and nobody was interested. Many of my friends died young from the cancer, but at that time we didn't think about this.
I came early to the conclusion that the nuclear test could be a hazard to health. Many other people did not believe this. From this point of view, I was a rebel.
To further study the effects of radiation and cancer, Joseph Rotblat left Liverpool for London in 1950. He accepted a position as professor of physics at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. There, he pioneered the use of radioactive isotopes as a diagnostic tool and helped develop the first scanner for the detection and treatment of disease.
Some of us, physicists who were somewhat disillusioned with the way our physics was being applied, we felt that we should perhaps try to find other ways in which which our work could be of more direct use to mankind than the nuclear physics turned out to be. And I began to do research work on the medical applications of nuclear physics. Well, this is where physicists produce instruments which helped in treatment or diagnosis of disease, which brought me into problems of the effects of radiation on the human body. And I felt much greater satisfaction from this.
I went to work for Professor Joseph Rotblat in St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Well, it was a bit strange because when you first went there, all the rest of the people on the floor were scientists, you know, they were all physicists or radiobiologists. He could be quite hard. He used to sometimes say things like, this office, you start work at 9. But he never used to join in very much in sort of like coffee breaks or anything like that. The only relationship was with Patricia, really. They were very close. She was a student of Prof's, and therefore she worked very closely with Professor Rotblat. They were trying to find out what caused cancer and what radiation, but they were using animal research, and they were using a lot of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki data.
Rotblat bought a house in North London, which he rewired himself. He planned to make this a home base for what remained of his family in Poland.
The reason he was able to secure visas for us all was because of his work at Los Alamos. I think the British government felt that he ought not to have family behind the Iron Curtain because of the, you know, the possibilities of blackmail and so forth, but he did get us all visas. We all came to England, my parents and my grandmother and my uncle and aunt. And he was able to work in non-military uses of atomic energy, which is what he wanted to do. He was not the kind of man to be told what to think.
We didn't understand how important he was. We just thought he was just a slightly mad Polish physics lecturer. Once you'd been to 2 or 3 lectures with Joseph Rotblat, you realized you were in the presence of an absolutely unique human being. I suppose my favorite lecture was the one he did, taking us from Newton to Einstein. We had just about grasped the notions of basic laws of thermodynamics as to how A led to B to move and so forth. And somehow, during the course of that time, he took us to E equals mc squared. There, that's simple, he said. We came out of that lecture thinking the world has changed. He really wanted to try and transform physics into a humanitarian project, into something that would help people help people.
I used to sort of almost have nightmares sometimes. I used to dream quite a lot of bombs exploding, you know, and didn't go into too many details, but it did used to sort of pull me down a bit. And I once asked Professor Rotblat what would he do if they was bombing, and he said, run towards it and make sure you got killed right at the beginning.
The nuclear club was expanding. Britain tested in Australia on Aboriginal lands. France was next, testing in Africa and Polynesia. And then China would become the 5th country to conduct atmospheric nuclear tests. America, the charter member of the club, tested constantly and enthusiastically. Even including scheduled test dates in Nevada tourism brochures. There was little concern for radiation hazards.
Now they knew they could safely cross the area under an aerial atomic explosion shortly after it had occurred.
They hauled out some brooms and gave us the brush off before we left position 2 for camp. Decontamination, they called it, in case we had some radioactive particles on us.
Faced with the intensive buildup of weapons among the member nations of NATO, the Soviet Union defiantly showed itself capable of mutually assured destruction.
Khrushchev tried to play this game, threatening Americans that we produce missiles as sausages. And I was starting to work in the rocket science. And he smiled on me and told me it was important that Americans will think that we have many more than we really had at that time. And it was very supportive to the American military-industrial complex that really started the missile race.
We're standing in the missile park, which has an example of almost every missile or rocket that's ever been tested at White Sands. One of the most important is the Nike Ajax and the Nike Hercules. Those were Cold War missiles. They were put around every large city in the United States during the Cold War, during the 50s.
Scientists sometimes themselves get out of control. Nuclear arms race was largely the result of such scientists being simply interested in new discoveries, making new gadgets. The military loved it.
Ever more missiles with even greater range and destructive power inspired the most senseless spending the world had ever seen.
People look at the days of the Cold War. My comment is, how many skirmishes and attacks and wars were avoided because of the threat to the would-be attacker of being wiped out with the touch of a button?
On March 1st, 1954, a button was pressed in the South Pacific. It set off an explosion 1,000 times more powerful than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima, and produced temperatures rivaling the surface of the sun. the age of the hydrogen bomb had dawned over Bikini Atoll. The extent and range of the fallout was grossly underestimated, and unsuspecting commercial vessels well outside of the restricted test area were contaminated. One of these was the Lucky Dragon, a Japanese fishing trawler now on display in a Tokyo museum. Visitors to the museum are moved by the story of the Lucky Dragon, especially when they hear it firsthand from Matashichi Oishi, one of the surviving crew members. The crew members of the Lucky Dragon were plagued with radiation sickness, and within months, one fisherman was dead. American authorities insisted that the effects of the fallout should be no greater than the radiation from an ordinary X-ray. That summer, Rotblat met Japanese scientist Professor Yasushi Nishiwaki. He gave Rotblat samples of the radioactive ash and the victims' medical records.
When he reported and made public the size of the thermonuclear test at Bikini Atoll, which affected the Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon, you know, that was originally reported in the papers as a far smaller explosion. Prof worked out, probably here in the office, that the effects that it had had meant that it must have been a much bigger explosion. And he did the maths and he did the physics. And he was persuaded not to publish it for some little time because of the difficulties it would make between the British and the American governments. But he became convinced that it was totally undemocratic not to let people know what was going on. So he published it. And to the whole full anger of the establishment came down on him yet again.
Scientists have a responsibility. So they have the duty to inform the public and not just leave it to the politicians to tell or not to tell, or very often misinform.
Terrible truths began to crystallize. At Tokyo's Tsukiji fish market, the largest in the world, A plaque marks the spot where tons of contaminated tuna were buried. It was estimated that 800 fishing boats were in the test area. Radioactive poisons had entered the human food chain, and through ocean currents and the atmosphere, spread throughout the world. The tragedy of the Lucky Dragon was the spark that set off a worldwide movement to ban nuclear weapons.
Let me start with a simplified picture of the atom of which all matter is built. Each atom resembles a solar system. It contains...
In April of 1954, the BBC broadcast a program outlining the dangers arising from the development of the hydrogen bomb.
The planets around the sun. Here's a rough
Joseph Rotblat was asked to explain the physics of the bomb.
nucleus, and there is the electron revolving around it. There is therefore no exaggeration when we say that the annihilation of all life on Earth is now within the range of possibilities.
Rotblat met another guest backstage, the esteemed British philosopher Lord Bertrand Russell. The two quickly became friends. Russell shared Rotblat's dismay over the development of the hydrogen bomb. They worked together to begin the campaign for nuclear disarmament and to organize an international conference of scientists to discuss the peril. Russell drafted a manifesto calling for humanity to take action. He sought the endorsement of the leading scientists and Nobel laureates of the day. The signed letters arrived, except one, from Albert Einstein.
When Bertrand Russell was flying from Rome to Paris, when the captain announced that he just had the news that Einstein had died. And so when Russell heard the news, he was completely shattered because he felt that without Einstein's endorsement, the whole project will collapse. But when he arrived in Paris, there was a letter from Albert Einstein with his signature endorsing the statement. And this is one of the last acts of Einstein's life.
The statement came to be known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto.
It's written in the most glorious English prose. And Rotblat was the youngest of all the signatories on this. And it was he who arranged the first press conference, which was at Caxton Hall here in London, when this was announced to the world's press. And I'll just read to you just a few of the paragraphs. In the tragic situation which confronts humanity, we feel that scientists should assemble in conference to appraise the perils that have arisen as a result of the development of weapons of mass destruction. We're speaking on this occasion not as members of this or that nation, continent or creed, but as human beings, members of the species man, whose continued existence is in doubt. Here then is the problem which we present to you, stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war?
The manifesto had a very good reception in the media. And we have received a number of letters from people offering their support. One of these letters was from Mr. Cyrus Eaton, who said he would be willing to pay for the whole conference on the condition that it was held in Pugwash. Now, in those days, the only word Pugwash known in England was that of a comic character, Captain Pugwash. He appears in a children's comic. As if it was just a hoax. We did. In fact, when Russell asked me to look into this, and I said, it's not worth it. But then, of course, I looked up in the in the gazetteer, and I find that the place Pugwash does exist.
Pugwash is a small village in Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada. This is the site of Thinker's Lodge, former summer home of Cyrus Eaton, a multimillionaire industrialist. Although he had trained to become a Baptist minister, a summer job with John D. Rockefeller set Eaton off on a different path. He did, however, retain his early instinct to do good in the world. This earned him the label capitalist with a conscience.
He had money, and that gave him independence. And certainly the scientists, Bertrand Russell and Joseph Rotblat and the others, had the right idea, but they didn't have the resources. This was not a place set up with hotels and restaurants where you would want to normally be bringing people from around the world. There were a few rooms here at Thinker's Lodge, and beyond that, they billeted people in private homes. It was a somewhat unbelievable scene. So you'd have these people that were really in charge of the Soviet Union's nuclear weaponry program having tea and toast with a very local family. This really became not just Thinker's Lodge, but the whole Pugwash community involved in these events. It was the only place in the world bringing together the East and West to talk about this perilous threat of nuclear weapons.
Led by Joseph Rotblat, 22 of the most influential scientists in the world came together from both sides of the ideological divide. Among them, Chao Bei-wan, the first scientist from communist China to visit the West, Kuzin, the brilliant Russian, and the Hungarian-American Leo Szilard, an eccentric genius. The politics of the Cold War made the meeting remarkable. It was, in effect, fraternizing with the enemy. Their mandate was simple. How could they stop nuclear war? Their bond was their sense of moral responsibility for unleashing on the world a perversely beautiful weapon of mass destruction.
The very first topic for discussion at the very first Pugwash conference were radiation hazards. And the government at that time assured us that there are no health risks whatsoever. They say we don't need to worry at all. Pugwash is unique in several important characteristics. One is that people come to Pugwash as individuals. We have small meetings, so we can sit around a table rather than making speeches, which turn very often into propaganda. One of the ways of doing this is to exclude the press from it, as our meetings are private. To a certain extent, this is our weakness, because the world doesn't know about us.
Pugwash would meet on an annual basis at conferences all over the world, returning for a 50th anniversary meeting in Nova Scotia in 2007.
The organizers of the meeting have agreed for a photo-only opportunity in the room. No audio, though. And this is because it's a 50-year tradition within the Pugwash movement of something called Chatham House rules. Anything that's said can't be attributed to any one person in the room, so that they could get the high-level people to speak relatively freely without fear of any retribution because of those comments. It's something that's been the key to Pugwash's success.
The risk of idealistic scientists revealing state secrets over a lobster dinner spooked every major spy agency. The FBI, the CIA, MI5, and the KGB. Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union made his a very personal interest.
All the Pugwash conferences was widely covered in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, my father, he met with the Soviet scientists when they asked them to meet with him, and he discussed with them what they would do there. Mostly he supported their ideas because it was not pro-Soviet, but it was not pro-American.
Khrushchev became a close friend of Cyrus Eaton. Using his considerable resources, Eaton campaigned to halt the arms race, normalize relations with the Soviet Union, and recognize communist China. It made him the lifelong nemesis of J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. Eaton was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Pugwash members got the same sort of scorn, and some were denounced as communist sympathizers, or even Eastern Bloc spies.
It's quite true that the Soviet government tried to use us. Interestingly enough, it took only a few years before the governments in the West, they tried in turn to take over Pugwash. And they came to me and said, told me who should be invited, what we should discuss, and so on. And I said, thank you very much, but we know how to do it ourselves. And so we had to fight sort of both sides. And I keep saying all the time that the path, of independence is a very narrow one, but we managed to keep on it.
Walking that narrow path led the Pugwash scientists to most of the world's continents. Discussions dealt primarily with nuclear issues, but also broadened to include chemical and biological weapons, the environment, arms trade, and regional conflict. The delegates often brought their spouses. The lasting friendships that formed across political divides became critical in times of international crisis.
Sometimes not the formal part of the meeting that is the best thing. It's the, the dialogue between people, or just that they meet someone from another country, and then they can go on from there. There was lots of very strong personalities, and so the arguments were often quite fierce. Most of the time that it was resolved, but there was quite often sort of simmering things going on in the background.
Sometimes the information exchanged would have shocked their respective governments.
The Pugwashites had tried to transcend the vested interests of military and industrial and scientific powers that were behind these war machines, to try and find a pathway to safety through that long twilight period of the Cold War. People genuinely were getting up every day waiting for nuclear annihilation.
The threat of global annihilation became a part of popular culture in literature, music, and the movies. The 1959 hit film On the Beach depicted the aftermath of a nuclear war. As the winds carried radioactive fallout to every continent, the last people on Earth awaited certain death in Australia.
They didn't think we'd fight no matter what they did. And they were wrong. We fought, we expunged them. We didn't do such a bad job on ourselves. We're all doomed, The whole silly, drunken, pathetic lot of us. We haven't got a chance.
I won't have it, Julian. I won't. There is hope. There has to be hope. There's always hope.
Fears of Armageddon took on a chilling reality with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
October 22nd, 1962. President Kennedy confirms reports that the Soviet Union is installing missiles with nuclear warheads in Cuba.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
We are lucky that in the time of the Caribbean crisis, President Kennedy, Prime Minister Khrushchev, my father, were a brave person. They thought that they must try to prevent the war, not to start the war, because they didn't know these consequences. The Cuban Missile Crisis was emotional and psychological shock to the American society, that now they're the same as others. Because the danger was in Cuba, 90 miles from American soil. And it was not such a fact in the Soviet Union, because the Soviets all the time lived under this pressure of the possible war.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Pugwash idea of a permanent hotline between Moscow and Washington was implemented. Both sides agreed to talk about the arms race. A fragile first step was taken in 1963 when a meeting chaired by Joseph Rotblat discussed the idea of a ban on nuclear testing.
We could use the fact that scientists knew each other so personally to use this channel of communication to try to influence events. For example, like during the time of the Cuban crisis.
Khrushchev, my father, he supported this movement to stop nuclear testing. And I was at that time in this rocket science, and I knew that the new warhead will be much lighter and much more powerful. And when he announced this moratorium without consulting with us, we was ready to test it. And I came to him and told, why are you doing this? And he answered me, these new inventions are endless. You can make it more and more destructive. We now can destroy the world. We have to think now how to save it.
Less than a year after the crisis, the USA, the USSR, and the United Kingdom all signed a treaty. The Partial Test Ban Treaty ended testing in the atmosphere and brought in controls for testing underground.
The success of Pugwash depends on its impeccable scientific integrity. It's been able to advise governments, and governments have listened to it. One of their main contributions being to produce means of verifying whether the treaties were being held, because you can't have a treaty not to use, let's say, chemical weapons or nuclear weapons unless there's a means for verifying that they aren't being manufactured or tested.
The monitoring of the underground tests was done by automatic sealed seismic black boxes, a Pugwash initiative which satisfied a Soviet concern over intrusive inspections.
We admit that you cannot disinvent nuclear weapons. We never say it cannot be done. But what we are saying, we can create a system of verification. We look at it and we find it can be done.
Nuclear weapons are easier and easier to make, but they do need fissile material. Work in a direction where fissile materials are controlled, where the particular parts that are needed for nuclear weapons are strictly regulated to the extent possible. You then decrease the possibilities. You never eliminate them, but you decrease the possibilities and probabilities for any group or country to make nuclear weapons. And so you've got to work incrementally.
Throughout the Cold War, the nuclear powers continued to engage in conflicts around the globe. North Korea, the Middle East, Africa, Vietnam. Although no nuclear devices were ever used, the threat of a tactical nuclear strike hung over every battlefield.
The Pugwash leadership realized the Vietnam War was a very dangerous development. An attempt was made to set up negotiations by using a direct channel, so to say, to reach Ho Chi Minh. The person involved from the American side as a liaison to the American government was Henry Kissinger. In fact, it was the beginning of the career of Kissinger. At that time, he was a professor at Harvard.
I think that the discussion of scientists from all over the world, discussing frankly among each other what the problems are, has contributed to clarifying the various points of view, and therefore, I believe, has made a contribution towards the easing of international tensions.
Utilizing Pugwash back channels, North Vietnam and the United States eventually came to the table in Paris and signed a peace treaty.
Our idea was mainly at that time to halt the arms race and to prevent a nuclear war. I might say that the fact that there's been no nuclear war, no further use of nuclear weapons, to a certain extent, may be the result of our work. It may sound very, very immodest, but speaking now from the way people told us, including the person who really factually stopped the nuclear arms race, and that is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he told me directly our effort has been helping in this direction. We had some very influential scientists in the Soviet Union who came to our meetings. And this process worked very well in the case of Gorbachev because our ideas percolated to him. I have great admiration for him because he had the courage to come out and say, enough is enough. We can't go on like this.
I now call upon the Peace Prize laureate of 1995, Professor Joseph Rotblat.
The Nobel Committee informed Joseph half an hour before the official announcement, and they asked him not to tell anybody. And Joe violated this prescription and made a phone call to me because I was then the Secretary General of Pugwash. It was the first time that the Nobel Prize was shared between an individual and an organization.
I said to him, "Can I have an invitation?" He said, "Do you want one? Why?" He was a modest man, really. And I said, "Are you serious? Do you think I will ever again be present at a Nobel Prize ceremony for an uncle of mine? Of course I want to go."
Long before the terrifying potential of the arms race was recognized, there was a widespread, instinctive abhorrence of nuclear weapons. But the world was then polarized by the bitter ideological struggle between East and West. However, after the collapse of communism, any rationale for having nuclear weapons disappeared. The nuclear powers still cling tenaciously to their weapons.
Into his 80s and 90s, Rotblat walked from his home to the Kilburn station, his briefcase bulging with papers, then took the tube to Bloomsbury. He then walked to the modest Pugwash headquarters across the street from the British Museum. 2 offices, jam-packed with creaking floors, which he shared with his assistant, Sally Milne.
It made a huge difference to him and to the work of Pugwash getting the Nobel Prize, because suddenly you just have more access to people.
Rotblat was tireless, taking his message to the highest places and to the streets. he kept vigil in a mock cell in support of Mordecai Vanunu. Vanunu, an employee at the Nuclear Research Center in the Negev Desert, alerted the world to a top-secret Israeli nuclear weapons program. Tried on charges of treason and espionage, he spent 18 years in prison, 12 of them in solitary confinement. For years, Rotblat praised Vanunu's courage and campaigned for his release.
Rotblat, because of his personal history, was a strong defender of whistleblowers, of which Vanunu was a prime example.
When the Cold War ended, things changed quite a bit. He gave a very sort of important speech at Halifax in 2003, Pugwash, when he thought that the dangers of nuclear proliferation were such, and were becoming such, that in his view it was as dangerous as some of the most dangerous times of the Cold War.
The difficulty is that the mood in Russia has changed in relation to nuclear weapons. And now, so the general mood is that Russia must keep the nuclear weapons. They must keep nuclear weapons almost as the only sort of expression of still being a superpower. And this means they want to keep on with them, and this has created a new difficult situation, and we have to somehow to deal with this.
Thank you all very much. Prof was by no means anti-American, but he was devastated, and he knew what the administration of George Bush would mean.
They hate the fact that we love freedom, and so they attacked us. And they thought we'd quit. They thought we were soft. We love our freedoms. Our biggest job is to make sure the American homeland is secure.
Anyone criticizing the Bush administration has immediately been branded as anti-American. The current polarization in the world is largely the consequence of the Bush slogan, "You are either with us or you are against us."
Impact.
The use of nuclear weapons is explicitly contemplated. They will be used in a conflict just like any other explosives. The danger of a new nuclear arms race is real.
Today in New Mexico, the scientists of Los Alamos are designing a whole new generation of nuclear weapons.
It's really an incredible thing to see the origins of it and just see how it's set American foreign policy and domestic policy for the next, well, right now. What sort of an impact it's having on the world today, you know, and the view of the world towards us as being the only people to have detonated not one but two bombs. For me, it puts it into perspective why the world looks upon us with such a fearful eye. We were the only ones to use this extraordinarily destructive weapon. I have very mixed feelings about commemorating it.
The whole house filled up with his papers, not just the garage, not just the loft, but it started like this. He filled up his study with tottering piles of papers. Then, having filled up his study, he had nowhere to work, so he moved into the dining room next door. He worked at the dining room table. Pretty soon, that too was covered with tottering piles of papers. Also the floor all around, the piano, and every other inch of space. I would sit down and chat to my uncle, and we discussed the news, we discussed all sorts of things. For instance, I asked him if he was an atheist, and he said, not an atheist, but an agnostic. I said, why? Because I call myself an atheist. And he said, as a scientist, I can never say that something is impossible.
He was certainly a very busy man and a very important man, and yet he still took time to ask about children. He kept a supply of children's books in his house so that if any kids came around that he would have a gift for them. He was just a very, very generous and very sweet man. When you work on these big issues of nuclear weapons, it can get very discouraging. And one time I asked Joseph Rotblat, I said, how is it possible, with everything that you have seen in the course of your life, how is it possible that you remain optimistic? And he looked at me with this wonderful, contemplative look for a little while, and he just said, well, what's the alternative?
Joseph Rotblat, whose life spanned nearly a full century, experienced the most murderous period in all of human history. Somehow, he remained optimistic.
Europe, look at the history. Whole generations were slaughtered in the wars. It's no longer conceivable for the countries which fought each other, mortal enemies in both world wars. And now you've got the European Union. And this is a very important step which occurred in our lifetime. And this gives me great hope. If you want peace, prepare for peace. And I want to change their mindset to along these lines. And this is the only way in which we could save the future of mankind.
If one of his great dreams for Pugwash was the elimination of nuclear weapons, the other was the elimination of war itself.
Wherever one views us and them and looks at the world in these terms, conflict comes about. That kind of hatred, which is then put into children, results in people being at war against each other. And when peoples go to war against each other, then it's much worse than states. That's what we have to avoid. Important not to put hatred in them.
We don't have a Eurocentric fear anymore. What we have is a world full of imploding nations. We have extremism that is interpreting itself into a rage that is articulated through terrorism. As we saw the reaction in the United States and the Western world to the two towers coming down, we have seen nothing until the first dirty bomb is blown by some terrorist and wipes out a good part of a city. If that ever happens, the impact on our civil liberties, on our human rights, those components of why humanity is advanced will take a nosedive. Then we'll turn into police states and God knows what other paranoia, panic reaction that we create. The aim of the exercise of Pugwash is to say, hey, that sort of warm, fuzzy feeling you had in your tummy about the Cold War equilibrium, even though you didn't agree with it, was there, doesn't exist anymore. You're in a whole new era with a lot of different players and with those who are not necessarily going to play by the rules. I think people actually believe that we'll never use them. I think people actually believe that it won't happen.
My nature is not to distrust, just the opposite. By nature, I believe fundamentally in the goodness of man.
Last night I had the strangest dream I'd ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war.
In the same year he was knighted, Sir Joseph Rotblat was a guest on a popular radio show. Among his favorite selections was the 60s peace anthem, "Last Night I Had the Strangest Dream."
I would like everybody to be conscious that they are members of a species which has a marvelous history, but whose continued existence can no longer be guaranteed. So let's walk with you. Take the other side. The joy of life, the beauty, continuation of life, beauty in the world. To retain it, to preserve it, not to let it disappear.
I dreamed I saw a mighty room filled with women and men, and the papers they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when the papers all were signed, 1,000,000 copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads, and grateful prayers were prayed. And the people in the streets below were dancing round and round, and guns and swords and uniforms were scattered on the ground. Last night I had the strangest dream I'd never dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put